Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome to day 115 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today's reading and commentary primarily comes from 2 Samuel, starting in chapter 8, verse 16 through chapter 10. Now, I will say there's a little bit of a celebration going on around me where I'm filming this today, so you possibly will hear some fireworks. So please excuse me for that interruption. Now, today's portion picks up really in chapter 9 as far as the commentary I wanted to cover. And David has remembered his pact, his agreement with his good friend Jonathan. And though Jonathan has died, David calls one of his servants in and says, "Are there any remaining members of Saul's family?" Because it still shows David's heart. He wants to do what is right. And you also have to realize that any of the remaining members of Saul's family, they would have been terrified of such an act. They would have thought, this is the king now seeking our lives so that there will not be any challenge to his throne. But the servant goes in search and finds that, yes, Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, is still alive. Now, this is the same Mephibosheth I'd mentioned a few chapters back, where when the nursemaid heard that his father and the king had been killed in battle, that she scooped Mephibosheth up to flee the palace so that no one else would come to try to kill the remaining members of the household to keep the royal line from continuing. And as she's fleeing the house, she falls and crushes his legs, making Mephibosheth a lifelong crippled. Now, the land that he ends up in, Lodabar, it basically means a desolate place, a place that there was no grazing, there would be no cattle. It was a place of just void, really. And that was so much of Mephibosheth's life to that point. He had nothing. He had no inheritance. He was probably living in great secrecy. And yet, now the king sends somebody looking for him. And David has compassion upon Mephibosheth. In many ways, it is like the Lord, or the Lord's servant, going in search of the lost sinner, that sheep that is fled, that sheep that is in sin and away from the flock. And when Mephibosheth is brought before the king, what does he do? He falls to his knees. He bows low before the king. He calls the king, he recognizes David's authority, and he says, "I'm your servant." That's the position that we also have when we come before the Lord. When we hear the Lord's message and we come before the Lord, we bow before him. We say, "I am nothing but your servant." It's a real picture when you look at the life of Mephibosheth and you see how David responds to him. It is that picture, really, of a lost sinner coming to the Lord. And then Mephibosheth is given servants. Even the very servant of David that had gone in search for Mephibosheth is now made Mephibosheth's servant. And this man now will oversee the crops, the fields, everything that had once belonged to King Saul has now been given to Mephibosheth. And David goes even a step further and says that, "Mephibosheth, you will eat at my table." Now, this could mean a couple of different things. I will say, I always teach this part. It doesn't necessarily mean that Mephibosheth was physically at David's table for every meal, but what it meant is that he would eat for the rest of his life the same choice foods that was given to King David and his family. That Mephibosheth would no longer be a pauper, but that he would eat the best. And it probably does mean that he did eat at the very table with David much of the time. What a wonderful picture, though, of the grace of God, that David sent his servant out to seek down the last remaining member. And then when he's brought in, keep in mind that it's the Mephibosheth's not worshiping the servant in the same way that the sinner, when he comes to the Lord, he doesn't worship the evangelist or the pastor. Mephibosheth worships the Lord, or worships David, and then David places Mephibosheth in the charge of his servant. So it's in the same sense of the pastor. The shepherd takes care of those who were once lost and have now been found. Well, we find in verse 10, or chapter 10, chapter 10, the Ammonites, the king of the Ammonites has died. And David sends a group of his servants to go and really just console the prince and to give their respects. We're so sorry to hear of your king's passing. And yet, those who are around the prince, the now to be king, they have his ear. And they begin to say, oh, I don't know, I think David sent these people here to mean you harm, to try to control you, to try to take your kingdom away from you. And this young prince to be king takes these men, shaves half their beard off, cuts their garments to the point that they are practically returning naked. They are left in a shameful condition to return to David. Here David sent them on a goodwill mission, and they're being returned shamed. Do you see a little bit of the same picture where Mephibosheth is brought in and honored, and he recognizes David's generosity? It's, as I say, it's that lost sinner being brought to the Lord. And now we have the men are being sent out. The evangelists, if you will, have been sent out, and they are not received, and they are humiliated, and they are even sent back to their home country in humiliation. And David even tells them, don't come right back into the city, because we don't want you to be humiliated any further. He wants these men to still keep their honor before their own people, before their own brethren. So he has them wait so that their beard will grow back out before they come back into the community. It shows David's respect for the mission that he sent them on. It shows that these men needed to regain their integrity. But it also shows the disrespect that others, that the heathen can have for the messengers of God or the messengers of the king. David will mount up an army, and things do not go too well for the Ammonites. 700 of their charioteers will fall in battle with David. This shows the strength and the might of David's army. But David didn't have that large of an army compared to what the nations around him had. But he continued to be victorious time and time again. Well, brothers and sisters, I hope that you're doing well. Till tomorrow, God bless.